Alright, welcome back. So things have been reconfigured, and through the magic of video I'm wearing a different outfit than I was in the previous video because for me it's actually been a few days. If you've been watching this thing straight through, then it hasn't been 3 days. Okay, so I think at the end of the last lecture we were dealing with speciation all over again, albeit at a very reduced level because we've had this in EBE. We know there are two types of models that are in existence to discuss overall how species are derived. But in any event, through this process of speciation, we have this new species. The new species could arise through a separation of one population into two, and now these two subpopulations are evolving independent of each other. Or we could have a new species just kind of magically occur through changes in chromosome number or changes in sets of chromosomes through polyploid events. We have the generation of this new species. So now what I want to talk a little bit about is kind of rarity within the context of what I'll call the lifetime of a species. So we know that species on the planet, go back to the slide here, species on the planet, the number of them has been changing, and we don't measure it at the species level because of fossils. We measure things at the family level. But the idea is the number of families as well as the number of species has been increasing, and certain fauna on the planet that show up as Cambrian fauna, those species are gone from the planet. They were gone about 200 million years ago. There are still a few of them left, but most of them have had their time in the sun and they've disappeared. So too of the Paleozoic fauna, right? They begin to come into existence to kind of replace the Cambrian fauna. An argument for that might be that whole ecological release, niche, Sympatric Speciation model. And then they had their life in the sun, and there aren't many of them still left. And now we're into this group of what we call the modern fauna, where many of them are still around, but we are in this kind of loss of species due to human influences period right now. Okay, so in any event, there are species whose numbers begin to increase, right? The speciation event here puts them on the planet. And at that time, they're very rare, and then they begin to do well, and they begin to spread around, and then at some point, they start to come back down the other side, and they become rare again until such a point that the species is now extinct. Right? And this would be number of individuals on the y-axis. So this is kind of this image here. Species are generally rare at their origination. That's the new species that's been produced through speciation. Doesn't matter how, but there it is. And then number two, they begin to spread out locally, and then they become widespread, maybe regionally or globally. And then toward the end of the lifespan, we're back to local distribution of the species until we get to 5 here, which is the species is rare again at the end of its lifespan. Okay, so one of the concerns for applied ecologists is endangered and species that we have concern about. So concerns, species of concern, endangered species, because they have this issue with rarity, they're kind of vulnerable, right? If the species only exists locally, then we're not operating under a metapopulation model, right? The species can go extinct locally, and that is extinction overall, whereas once the species is distributed more regionally, now we're talking about the ability to lose the species local without losing the entire species because it still exists in some other part of the world. So let's just talk a little bit about this, and then I have some examples to show you. So this first one, Stephanomyria exigua, exists in Washington State. And somehow this little piece of Stephanomyria exigua got separated from a very, very, very tiny population. And this tiny population that was separated underwent allopatric speciation. There are multiple types of allopatric speciation. We don't cover those in ecology. If we had a nice evolutionary biology class, we would talk more about these. But this is more of a what we call quantum speciation or punctuated equilibrium, where something happens and you get the very quick development of this species through allopatric. And this little population was separate enough from the larger Stephanomyria population that it developed into this Stephanomyria malarensis. Those of you that know Latin or French know that the root word for this is this one, which in French means sad. So the common name for this one is the sad lettuce, and it's sad because it's on its way out. It developed as a new species, right, through allopatric speciation, but at that time when it originates, it's very rare. And it only occurs in this one spot on the planet, this little tiny corner here of the Stephanomyria exigua population. So this lettuce is sad because it's probably not going to make it. In fact, even talking now, it may already be gone. I don't know. There's so few individuals. It's such a limited population sitting here that it's exposed to a bunch of issues related to being rare. So we talked about these before as evolutionary processes in EBE, but they are ecological processes because they're playing out over these short time scales. So, small population. All right, this sad lettuce is in this tiny little population. What are the problems associated with being in a small population? Well, the first has to do with the increased importance of genetic drift. Remember, genetic drift is basically sampling error. So if I have an individual here, it undergoes reproduction to produce an offspring here, right, an offspring. Then that offspring is what alleles that offspring ends up with are subject to this sampling error, right? There could be a great deal of diversity in this individual, but it's entirely possible that mating between two individuals with a lot of genetic diversity produces an offspring that really doesn't have much diversity, right? I could lose alleles because they aren't selected to appear in the next population during reproduction. So this genetic drift process means that some alleles don't get passed to offspring, and that means, again, typically that with genetic drift, the more important genetic drift becomes, the more genetic diversity tends to be lost from a population. So this loss of random alleles from the population because they don't get sampled during meiosis and end up in the next generation, right? So whatever genetic diversity this tiny little population here has, because the population is small, we're likely to lose any genetic variation that exists within this population, okay? Now, along with the loss of genetic diversity, we have another problem that's going to rear its ugly head, and that one has to do with natural selection. We know that in order for natural selection to work, it works best or strongest if there's a lot of genetic diversity in a population. So as genetic drift begins to operate on this sad lettuce, it loses alleles from the population, reducing its genetic diversity. The less genetic diversity I have, the less natural selection can work on this population. The lower the ability of natural selection to work on this population, the less ability the population has to adapt. Now, I'd expect there are all sorts of things that it has to adapt to. There have got to be pests and pathogens on this closely related species that probably affect it as well. So I'm guessing that as adaptation begins to grind to a halt because of the decreased ability of natural selection to work because of decreased genetic diversity, the population becomes more susceptible to things like pests and pathogens. It also is more susceptible to any kind of change in the environment, such as changes in temperature, changes in moisture levels throughout the year. Populations depend on this diversity to be able to undergo adaptation to changing environments. Environments change, right? The planet has been changing for billions of years. I have no expectation it's going to stop changing now. And these changes, as they occur, they become more difficult for the species to deal with these changes if it doesn't have any raw material to work with to produce adaptations to this changing environment. Okay? All right, now, also, if the number of individuals in the population is small, there's also the possibility of inbreeding kicking in, along with any negative effects of the inbreeding. That would be inbreeding depression. If I'm a small population here, and by chance when this population got separated, it began to develop with a few closely related individuals, because in plants there is a spatial structure to the genetics, right? The seeds only travel certain distances. I would expect that it's more likely that individuals close to you are more related to you. So these individuals are probably more related to each other than an individual would be related to somebody over here. So this inbreeding depression, it's possible it begins to kick in. That lowers fitness, which further decreases the size of the population, which leads to drift and natural selection issues, and finally adaptation issues. So if I had a hat, I'd take off my hat for the sad lettuce here, because it appears that this species, when it started, just didn't have enough genetic variation to keep it going so that it could move from this localized species to a regional species. Okay? So in this case, our population of sad lettuce here is probably not going to make it. Okay? And I think I mentioned before, allopatric speciation is a tricky one for species to deal with, because once the new species is created, you automatically have reduced the size of the population, which means you've made it harder for certain evolutionary forces to work. In particular, natural selection. It requires this genetic diversity. Well, you've gotten rid of it, so populations that are produced allopatrically often go through this low fitness, and some species are going to have trouble getting out of that, which is this one. Okay? On the other hand, other species when they're produced, are produced through a sympatric speciation model. Here is an example of a sympatric speciation model. We've got Helianthus annuus and Helianthus petiolaris. These are closely related sunflower species. And they can produce species through hybridization. Changes in chromosome number because of mistakes in meiosis made in both parents at the same time. So this is Helianthus annuus and Helianthus petiolaris. We're producing, right, an offspring here, and depending on which chromosomes got messed up in meiosis, we produce a possible 3 species types here. Now, with sympatric speciation, you don't go through this dip. There isn't this genetic drift and founder effect and the bottleneck and decreased natural selection, decreased adaptation. Often what you get with these sympatric speciation events is this new species created because it can't reproduce with either of the 2 parents. It would be a new species. But because of changes in chromosome type and number, you actually end up with species that often are better adapted to certain environments than the parents, right? It's all about genetics anyway. Let's change the genetics, shuffle it up to get this new species. It often does better than the parents. So what's funny about these 2 species, petiolaris and annuus, is they both require water, a lot of it, right? Sunflowers like a lot of water. On the other hand, look at where this one's growing, look at where this one's growing. That soil looks really dry, and it is, and that's about as dry as you can get, right? That's desert. Well, Helianthus anomalus, Helianthus paradoxus, and Helianthus deserticola are all adapted to arid regions. They don't do well where the parents live. They do well in environments where the parents don't live. The parents live in these wet environments. The offspring, they end up through seed dispersal in these dry habitats and do very well there.